Hi everyone. In this lab, you're going to learn about eukaryotic parasites or eukaryotic pathogens, so eukaryotes that cause disease. And we're going to focus on three different eukaryotic parasite groups. We're going to talk about Protozoa, Helminths, which are worms, and Arthropods. And in each category, we're going to look at specific examples of each. So these are all eukaryotic parasites that cause disease. And usually parasites are pathogens. So the objectives of this lab, and we'll talk about this again in the end of lab, but just to keep it in mind in the beginning, for all eukaryotic parasites, I want everyone to leave lab knowing what they would look like. Like if you were in lab, you would actually look at them under the microscope, but we have microscope pictures here in this lab. So know what everything looks like, the PowerPoint pictures, the official name, the binomial nomenclature of the pathogen, the disease it causes, the etiology or cause of the disease, the mode of transmission, prevention methods, and we'll get back to this in the end. Okay, to start off with some background. So eukaryotic parasites are all eukaryotes. They're part of the domain Eukarya. And the groups of eukaryotic parasites we're going to talk about are Protozoa, Helminths, and Arthropods. So we're going to focus on those three. I want everyone to know that Protozoa are unicellular and Helminths and Arthropods are both multicellular organisms. And we're going to talk about parasites in each group. Not all groups are necessarily parasites. A parasite is an organism that lives in or on a host, and usually it benefits by harming the host, by taking nutrients from the host, taking up your food, your nutrients, different components in your blood. That's why a lot of times we see anemia with different eukaryotic parasitic infections. Parasites can infect anybody, but we specifically see severe infections with immunocompromised individuals, which is the case for many diseases. So keep that in mind. And we're going to focus on three categories of parasites in this lab. We're going to talk about parasitic protozoa, parasitic helminths, and parasitic arthropods. And in each group, we're going to give three examples. So I want everyone to end this lecture or lab knowing what all 9 of these cause, what they look like, details about each one of them. And we're going to start with parasitic protozoa. So parasitic protozoa are eukarya. They're all eukaryotes, and they're unicellular organisms, meaning they're made up of one cell. When they infect humans, the form they're in is called trophozoites. It's the vegetative form, meaning the form that reproduces. In the environment, protozoa are in a form called a cyst. Cysts are similar to bacterial spores. Remember how bacterial spores can avoid stressful conditions, lack of nutrients, dry conditions, different chemicals. That's what cysts are for protozoa. And the human hosts get these infections usually by ingesting cysts from contaminated food or water. Groups of protozoa are grouped depending on how they move usually. So amoebas have pseudopodia, flagellates move by flagella, ciliates move by cilia, and sporozoans have non-motile adult forms. So the 3 protozoa we're going to look at right now are Giardia, lamblia, Trypanosoma brucei, and Plasmodium falciparum. And I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of these, so just keep that in mind. Giardia lamblia is a protozoa, and it causes the disease giardiasis. And this is caused by a protozoa. It can be asymptomatic, but usually the symptoms are diarrhea. And the transmission is fecal-oral, meaning that someone gets it, like if someone is infected and they go to the bathroom and they don't wash their hands and they prepare food, you can get the infection. The cyst is also transmitted by drinking water contaminated with feces. So if you have a water source for community and there's feces coming into it, that can lead to bad Giardia infections, this protozoa. And inside the body, the cysts will give rise to the trophozoites. Remember, these are the vegetative forms, and these attach to the small intestine, start reproducing, and this causes all the diarrhea and the inflammation in the small intestines. Prevention is you want to drink clean water, so boiled water, filtered water, sanitary preparation of food and proper hand hygiene. This is why it's important to wash our hands, among many other things. So when we look at this microscope image, here is a fecal image. So if you have someone infected and you take a fecal sample, we see trophozoites in the sample. It's not very clear, but they look like teardrops. So this is what they look like, and they have flagella. And then in the environment, they look like cysts. So again, here's a Giardia, lamblia, protozoa picture. Here's the cyst, what they look like in the environment. And then during infection, they're trophozoites, which are teardrops that have flagella. This picture isn't great, but this right here is a trophozoite. So that's Giardia, lamblia. The next protozoa or protist we're going to talk about is Trypanosoma brucei. This causes African sleeping sickness, and it's exactly what the name says. It's a very bad sleeping sickness. We see this in West and Central Africa, and the symptoms are bad body pain, fever, chills, anemia. It can lead to very, very disrupted sleeping cycles, and it can lead to coma and death. This one, Trypanosoma brucei, is transmitted by the tsetse fly. The fly is a vector, meaning that it can hold the protist and transmit it from one person to the next. The best way to prevent getting African sleeping disease from the vector is to avoid exposure to the vector, which is the tsetse fly, by wearing proper clothes, insect repellents, insecticides, window screens, bed nets. So when we look at it under the microscope, if we take a blood sample, here are all the red blood cells or erythrocytes. The Trypanosoma protists look like worms. They're not worms though, they're protists, because we will talk about worms later. This is what they look like in the blood smear. And again, the vector is the tsetse fly, and it causes African sleeping sickness. The next protozoa, which is very, very common in the world, is Plasmodium falciparum, and this one causes malaria. So Plasmodium causes malaria, and it is a disease that infects over half of the world, and it's very serious in children under 5 years old who get it. We see it in tropical and subtropical areas of Africa, Asia, and America. When I say tropical and subtropical, I typically mean that these areas are very, very warm environments. So when you look at these environments, they're warm. Warm environments are what mosquitoes like, and here the transmission is through a mosquito. So the Anopheles mosquito is a vector for the Plasmodium protozoa. And this is how it's transmitted. Prevention is to avoid exposure to the mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito. Drain standing water and make sure that you're wearing proper clothing to avoid these mosquito bites. If we look at a blood sample from someone who's been infected with a Plasmodium falciparum protozoa, we see little purple red dots in red blood cells, and this is indication that this person has malaria, is infected with this protozoa. Okay, we're done talking about the protists. Now we're gonna talk about Helminths, which are worms. So worms that are parasites. Again, everything here is eukaryotic parasites, so they're part of domain Eukarya. These are multicellular organisms, so Helminths or worms have many cells that make them. Worms have a complete digestive tract and steal nutrients from their host. That's why how they're able to grow and reproduce. They have complex life cycles, and they can have multiple hosts. There's 3 groups of worms or Helminths I want everyone to know. There's nematodes, cestodes, and trematodes. Nematodes, a common name for them are roundworms. Cestodes, a common name for them are tapeworms. Trematodes, a common name for them are flukes. All are worms. The 3 Helminth worms you're going to look at in lab is Ascaris, Taenia, and Schistosoma. And I'm going to talk about each one of these Helminths specifically. We're going to start with Ascaris lumbricoides. This is a nematode, and it causes the disease ascariasis, and the symptoms are usually bloody sputum. It causes shortness of breath, it can cause vomiting, and can affect the intestines, definitely leading to very bad intestinal pain. It's transmitted fecal orally, meaning it comes out in the feces. Someone doesn't wash their hands, or you eat food or water contaminated with this this nematode, the Ascaris. Prevention is sanitary disposal of human feces. This is why we're not supposed to use human feces as fertilizer. Keep hands out of mouth, proper hand hygiene, wash, peel, cook fruits and vegetables. Though I think everyone has developed very proper sanitation after coronavirus, so it's good to avoid a lot of things, not just coronavirus. If we look at a fecal sample, we can see that Ascaris, the eggs of these nematodes, and they look very bumpy. So this is what they look like. This is what you're focusing on here, these bumpy eggs in a fecal sample. And this is the microscopic image, so when they're eggs, and then when they're adults, you can actually see the very gross nematode Ascaris lumbricoides. The next worm we're going to talk about is Taenia solium. Taenia solium is a cestode, and it causes the disease Taeniasis, and the other one, it's a cestode, and it's characterized by mild and non-specific symptoms depending on the course of infection. Lots of abdominal pain, as with all worm infections, can lead to headaches and bad seizures. It's transmitted by eating undercooked pork. That's why pork has to be very well cooked, or fecal oral. And the prevention is do not eat undercooked pork and take fecal oral precautions depending on the disease. When we look at a muscle slide picture, this is where we see the Taenia solium, so the cysts inside muscle tissue. This is the microscopic image, and again, we see it in muscle tissue. And here is the non-microscopic image when we actually see the tapeworm or the cestode Taenia solium. The final helminth or worm we're going to talk about is Schistosoma mansoni. This is a trematode, and it causes rash, abdominal pain, diarrhea, can lead to liver and spleen enlargement. Transmission is skin penetration, so through the skin by larvae of the Schistosoma trematode. Prevention is avoid contaminated water, as with all of these, sanitary disposal of human feces. And with this organism specifically, Schistosoma mansoni, snails are an intermediate host. So you have the environment, different hosts, snail, human host. And so if snails are infected, the intermediate host needs to be killed. So using different side agents, remember these chemicals that can kill the intermediate host. And here, if we look at a fecal sample of someone that's been infected with Schistosoma mansoni egg, you can see the Schistosoma mansoni eggs. And they have a very distinct shape. So they have this little bump here. That's how you know that they're Schistosoma eggs. I want everyone to look at every image and make sure in your head you can differentiate what everything looks like. If I were to cover up everything and just tell you what is this, you should know that this is Schistosoma mansoni. It's a trematode, and it is transmitted by skin penetration. Finally, we're going to talk about the last eukaryotic parasite group, which is arthropods. Arthropods are multicellular organisms. There's two groups of arthropods. There's insects, which have 6 legs, and arachnids, which have 8 legs. Examples of insects are mosquitoes, fleas, lice, bugs, flies, and arachnids, which have 8 legs, are ticks and mites. They are ectoparasites, meaning that they consume blood or tissue fluid from the host, which is a bad thing. So they take their meal from the host. We're concerned with arthropods, not because of the arthropods themselves necessarily, but more that they can act as vectors. A vector is something that carries disease. They can act as mechanical vectors or biological vectors. Mechanical vectors are when the arthropod, or for example, when the insect carries a pathogen on their body and disposes it on a host. So it's mechanical transmission. Maybe you have a fly that's holding a virus or a bacteria or anything on its legs, and then it lands to you. That's mechanical transmission. Biological vector is when they carry the pathogen from one host to another inside them, like as if it was in blood. Mosquitoes can be vectors for malaria, Zika virus, many other things. Ticks can carry Lyme disease. So just know that these arthropods are concerned with insects, is not necessarily the insect themselves, but that they could be vectors of disease. The arthropods we're going to talk about are the Anopheles mosquito, the Ixodes tick, and the Sarcoptes scabei mite. This causes scabies. We're going to look at all 3 of these. The Anopheles mosquito causes insect bites. So I think everyone is familiar with what an insect bite looks like. This is the Anopheles mosquito. They need warm and moist environments. This is why they're very common in tropical and subtropical regions in Africa, Asia, America, warm regions. They cause insect bites, but we're more concerned with them being vectors for disease. So the Anopheles mosquito is a vector for malaria, for Plasmodium, which causes malaria, the protist. And the prevention of this is to avoid exposure to the vector. The next arthropod is Ascaris tick. This causes a tick bite. This is what the tick looks like. And the tick attached to host from other humans or animals. Prevention is avoid the vector. And if you do get the tick, remove it with forceps. So this is, you can see the lifestyle of a tick from the larva, which is very tiny, all the way to the adult. When we look at when we look at some arthropod ticks here, arthropods, the female ticks that have taken a big blood meal are very engorged. They're huge. It's really disgusting. But before a blood meal, they're very small. And then finally, the last arthropod we're going to talk about is a Sarcoptes scabei arthropod. This is a mite. It causes the disease scabies, and this is what they look like. The transmission is direct contact with the host or items that they have touched. And the best way to prevent scabies with the Sarcoptes mite is to avoid contact with people who are infested or items they've touched, such as bedding. And then finally, to just summarize everything, I want everyone to take time understanding each of these eukaryotic parasite or eukaryotic pathogens. So we talked about protozoa, we talked about helminth, and we talked about arthropods. So take time understanding each one, examples of each one, know what they look like, know the difference between mechanical and biological vectors with arthropods when we talked about, know the official name of everything like Plasmodium, falciparum. The disease it causes is malaria. Etiology is it's a protist, protozoa. Mode of transmission is a mosquito. Prevention methods, avoid the mosquito. So go through each one and know this, and I hope you guys really take time studying this, and good luck with this.